Thank you so much for staying. Like I said, we will have a couple of interviews. I'll be bringing you that one on the Association of Students Living with Disabilities much later. But it's time to have a very important conversation about privatization of education. This is an interesting one because as a group, right, or there is a campaign against privatization and commercialization of education, and it's called Kovey, and it's been partnering different agencies, the Education International, that's the EI, and the Frederick Egbert Stiftung Foundation, to advocate for improvement and expansion in public education infrastructure. And you know why? Obviously, because we're talking quality, we're talking about equity, we're talking about accessibility for all children. And this morning I've been joined by Richard Kovey. He is on my far left. He is the convener of Kovey, and Dennis Signolo is on my immediate left. He's Educational International Africa Regional Director. Great to have you here, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, I mean, just thinking about the whole concept, right? About campaigning against the privatization of education. Mr. Kovey, do you mind telling us what this is all about, how long you've been working, and what your dream is?
Yeah, so, it all started as far back in 2000 when we have our country's ratified education for all goals. And it was supposed to be, that concept is supposed to end in 2015. But after the assessment, most countries couldn't meet the targets. So it is really profiled into what we now call Sustainable Development Goals. So for education, we are looking at Goal 4. Now, after this, what that want to say, every single child born on the surface of the earth is supposed to have access to at least basic education. And then because not all of us will have the opportunity or the means to educate our children in very expensive private schools, the states, through, let's look at Ghana, our constitution, Article 25, 1A, talks about the part that the states has a sole responsibility of making sure every single Ghanaian have access to education. And so based on that, then when you come to 2, then the 25, 2 is also talking about the giving the opportunity to individuals to also provide education at a fee. So, but then that should also be done within the regulatory frameworks. So what we've noticed along the line is that because the Constitution makes provision for private participation in education delivery, government begins to see that as its main responsibility to the private sector.
Right.
So if you observe last year, if you monitor, Ghana Statistical Service put out a report that says in Ghana we have over 1.2 million Ghanaians between the ages of 4 to 18 who have never been enrolled in any school. That's very worrying. Then apart from that, we did some monitorings. That also shows that we have about 150,000 children who drop out of school, and then on annual basis. And then on daily basis, we have about 30 people dropping out of school. That's what the study that we did in 2021. It was Africa Education who did the study for us. So if you have a country and we are talking about productivity, we are now in economic distress, and then you have this chunk of your population that not having access to education, definitely what it means is that you are not going to achieve your there's going to be suffering. So basically the concept, we are not necessarily saying that they should close down every private school in Ghana, no. The concept is the government should not cede its core responsibility of making sure every Ghanaian has access to education to the private sector.
Right.
And so when you look at our study again, between 2008 and 2018, private schools increased by 98%. As again, 13% probably. The government also able to put on a percentage basis 13% school within that 10-year period. What private schools grew by this. Now, when you ask the policymaker, they tell you, oh, we don't have space and land to build school, but the private person is getting land every day to put up school. Even they're able to put up school on one plot. And then, so if the state who has all this at its disposal, it can even do have what you call compulsory acquisition of land when they see the need for this. Then you notice that most of the newly developing areas, you go to Kaswa area, you go to Gan West, Gan South, And all across the country, the lands that were reserved for social, very
right.
good.
I'll come back to you shortly, but let me find out from Mr. Signolo, because you have a wider view than just Ghana, right? You are with the Education International Africa. Tell me what you also do and how it feeds into CAPCO's whole agenda.
Yes, thank you for having me. First of all, let me briefly tell the audience who Education International is. We're the Global Federation of Education Unions. Our members are teacher unions and unions of education support professionals. We have 32.5 million members globally in 178 countries through our national affiliates. Therefore, the teacher unions in Ghana are part of this umbrella body called Education International.
Right.
Now, coming specifically to your question, Education International advocates for quality public education.
Okay.
We believe very seriously that every child and every young person should have access to quality public education. Why is that so? As Richard said earlier, it's important to recall the commitments made by our governments, including the government of Ghana through the United Nations in 2000, in 2015 specifically, where they committed to provide free and compulsory quality education of at least 12 years. That includes minimum at least 1 year of pre-primary education and then free primary and free secondary education. It's a global commitment by our governments. So the reason we call upon the government of Ghana and upon all governments in Africa to do this is because we care so deeply about our students. We care so deeply about human rights. So that's why we're calling upon them to invest in education. Now, we do several things as Education International. We work with our member organizations in various countries around the globe and in Africa to make that call for quality public education. We also engage in various activities, including capacity building, including research. We support our colleagues in Ghana to carry out research. For example, the research that Richard was talking about, we were collectively involved, at least in funding it from our perspective.
Right.
And then we organize various workshops, conferences, and so on to create a platform for education unions from Africa or from any other part of the world to come together and share experiences.
All right. Mr. Signore, so to the heart of the conversation, which is about pushing for better public education when it comes to quality, access, and everything. When I was growing up, I had stories of the generations before me and how, during their time, public education was the preferred form of education, because then you knew that you were getting the best of teaching, the best of logistics, the best of everything. But along the line, it began to shift. So now you realize that in private schools, children are usually given the very best form of education and exposed to, the most modern trends and all that. As Education International, you've just spoken about research, but have you cared to find out what caused that shift and what the remedy to the problem is, based on what you discovered as the major, changing factor?
Yeah, first of all, we've done a lot of research to compare the performance of private and public schools, by the way. We've done this in Liberia, in Kenya, and Uganda, and other places. If you account for home background and the provision of resources, infrastructure, teachers in a school, there's no difference, by the way. So what has gone wrong is simply because our governments have not been investing sufficiently in public education. Class sizes are just too large for teachers to be able to meet the individual needs of students. Infrastructure is very poor. Here in Ghana, you have children learning under trees or in temporary structures. That's not acceptable in the 21st century. Surely, children will be exposed to the elements of weather. If it's raining or it's windy, it's hot, it will be difficult to continue learning under those circumstances. So the bottom line is that governments are not investing sufficiently in education. There are international benchmarks for financing education. For example, within the UN system, a government must invest a minimum of 20% of its national budget in education, or at least 6% of gross domestic product, GDP. But how does the government of Ghana measure up? The government of Ghana is investing 12.9% instead of 20%. So if the government of Ghana were to increase investment in education, that would unlock more resources to build more schools, provide adequate infrastructure, probably not adequate, but at least substantial improvements in infrastructure, teaching and learning resources, but also to support teachers through training and professional development.
Right. So let me come back to you, Mr. Kovey. There's also the issue of low fee for profit schools, and it's something you're also campaigning against. So first of all, I'd just like for you to explain to us what low fee for profit schools are and why you think that they shouldn't exist.
Yeah, so before I come to your question, let me say CAPCO is, like director said, it's made up of the teacher unions here in Ghana. So it's a coalition, and then civil society organizations. So we have a lot of, it's a big coalition. Yeah, so when we started our campaign, that was far back in 2015, we noticed that instead of the donor partners, if you remember 2019, just recently, USAID put out a report where they assert that communities in the northern part of Ghana want their children to go to low-cost profit schools, what they call low-fee for profit schools. So instead of supporting the states to invest heavily in education, they are rather now channeling their resources to individuals. So what we are going to see is that it's a concept developed by one professor, Nicholas Tully of Buckingham University, that says that you can make money out of the poor. So those schools are not there to assist, to support the people there to access education, but they're there to make profit out of them. That is a concept we are against. Because if you, as a donor, instead of supporting the states and monitoring and making sure the right things are done, you are now channeling your resources, and you make our government sign for free universal basic education. Then you go behind and now finance an individual to sell education to the poor, not even the rich, the poor. That is an injustice. So that is why our one of the key areas we are looking at. So any school being sponsored by a donor partner through funding, we have World Bank is financing some of these individuals. Global Partnership for Education, they're all beginning to channel their resources to that plan under the guise of the people want private school. But then when we did a study far back in 2015, even before this, we used to have what we call the Omega Schools franchise. If you look at the way the school is run, if you do not have money today, you are not supposed to come to school. What happened to the child's learning? So anytime you come to school, you have to pay the arrears. For those days you are not even in school, you still have to pay for the arrears. So it's an exploitation.
Right. So this clearly means that it comes to the feet of government and making public school enticing enough, making public school available enough. So, Mr. Signolo, for you, you just told us about your partnerships with CAPCO and other teacher unions here in Ghana and across Africa. But have you been engaged in governments as well? Have you engaged the government of Ghana, for example? You just mentioned about the issue of children schooling under trees. Recently, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, not too recent though, some children died in an unfortunate incident where the school collapsed on them. And we have schools that look like they're going to fall any moment from now. What has been your engagement with our government and other governments across the region?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start with other governments. In fact, like I mentioned earlier on, we've done work in Kenya, we've done work in Uganda. In fact, in Uganda, the president himself of the country, His Excellency Yoweri Museveni, attended our event. So Bridge International Academies, who were running schools there, were recruiting unqualified teachers, and they brought a curriculum from the United States, which is not acceptable because the curriculum should be rooted in the local context. So we were able to challenge that, working with the government, and the government was able to close some of the Bridge schools from 36 to 3 now as we speak. Similarly, in Kenya, the government actually, looking at the research studies we've carried out, they were not aware before. They visited schools to find out, the ministers visited schools to find out what was happening in these schools. They were shocked by the quality of infrastructure that was provided. Teachers were working using tablets, just like machines, just reading a lesson in front of children. So that deprofessionalizes them. So similarly in Liberia, we worked with the government to push back on the privatization of the public education system. So we've made good progress. Coming to Ghana, yes, we've engaged with the authorities. We've engaged even with the Honorable Minister of Education on the 22nd of June. We had a meeting here in Accra where we're looking at the challenge of privatization, but talking about the importance of investing in public education. And the minister was the keynote speaker at that event. He agreed with us. Yes, but what we're looking for really is not just a verbal agreement, it's action on the ground. Agree, yes, but take a step further, take concrete legislative action.
Do you see that happening?
In Ghana or elsewhere?
In Ghana.
Where there is a will, there's a way. So we need political will and commitment from the government. I know that the government would say, oh, there is no money because we've even borrowed from the IMF and recently from the World Bank, which brings its own problems, by the way, because that money comes with conditions. But sticking on this particular subject, what we are saying is that actually out of the little that you have, give education a fair share, which is minimum 20%, not 12.9%.
Interesting. So, Mr. For you, Mr. Kovey, I mean, your name, right? Campaign against the privatization and commercialization of education. Just creates an outright impression that you're not for private schools at all, right? And I don't know how that will work. Or is it a case that you want a balance of the system? Because whether we like it or not, as things stand now, for many people, private schools are coming to the rescue. And unfortunately, I know you went beyond IMF and all that. We've seen with beyond education, it appears that for us here in Ghana, and I can speak for Ghana because this is where I live and what I know, you realize that when private people handle businesses that sometimes were being handled by government, it does better. Recently, we said we're going to sell assets of 17 state-owned enterprises. Right? And then you see that when a private person handles it, it gets better. So why don't we think more of a measure, or when it comes to education, it must be public and that's what you're solely rooting for?
Yeah, so education basically is a public good. It's not a commodity that's supposed to be put out there on the market for people to buy.
Right.
And then if you look at the poverty level in Ghana, if you want to commercialize education in terms of, because it's of quality, but first of all, let me ask, why is it that everybody would prefer to go to Achimota, Pre-Circle, Pre College, other than maybe in Sawam Senior High School or any other? Is the infrastructure and the resources available? You get it? So in a learning environment, the child should be exposed to to explore and develop his or her potential. So if the learning environment is under 3, what are the potentials that the child is going to derive? When the structure is not there, they are congested in the classroom. How do they get that exposure? So if our campaign is to make government turn its focus on improving basic education. Now, you could see that when they introduce the free SHS, basic education is totally forgotten. The only time you talk about it is when they write the BEC and then they are doing analysis. Then we say, then after that we go back. Look at the education subset, a basic education subset of even the 12.9% that was allocated for this, about 16%. The chunk is going for a free senior high school and then the tertiary institutions. Now, if every child between the ages of 0 and 10, that's where a lot of skill, language, and that's where we can form the character, the right behaviors that we want as a country. So if you leave them under the mercy of the weather and then they struggle their way through and then they get to this, before we say we are doing sensitization, conscientizing them against bad, immoral, this and all that, definitely it's not going to work because they have already formed that bad behavior and they are comfortable with it.
Right. Mr. Signolo, do you want to take, sorry to interrupt, we just need to start wrapping up any moment from now, but Mr. Signolo, do you want to take a bite of that as well? What exactly are we asking? He has just said education is not a commodity. It's for public good, but it is a necessity. And because people understand the importance of education, they're willing to part ways with sometimes huge sums of money to give their children the foundation. And we're talking about basic education here, which is also very vital because, and you spoke about Achimota and all, because many people would push their children into private basic schools and then don't mind if they go to public high schools or public universities because they know that once my child has a good foundation, I'm okay. Are we asking for balance here, or do you totally agree with Mr. Kovey that no privatization of commercialization?
Yes, definitely we agree. Don't forget, education is a basic human right and a public good. And our governments, including the government of Ghana, have committed to provide free and compulsory education for all of at least 12 years. So that commitment is essential. It must be fulfilled. In fact, the government of Ghana has been one of the, at least verbally, one of the proponents of quality public education, even financing education, supporting the Global Partnership for Education. So what we're calling for really is for governments to meet their commitments. On the 24th of January this year, Education International launched a campaign called Go Public Fund Education. Go Public Fund Education. So through this campaign, we'll be calling upon governments in Africa and around the world to invest in education. In fact, we're working with the African Union. Right. You probably know that 2024 has been designated the Year of Education by the African Union. So we will be working with them to draw the attention of governments to invest in education, in teachers, and education support personnel.
So, I mean, in wrapping up, which ones should be tackled immediately? Because, you know, sometimes it gets very complex and complicated. So there's the issue of textbooks, there's the issue of infrastructure, there's the issue, even the issue of quality of teachers. We recently started our licensure exams, and that has raised a whole lot of conversation about if teachers cannot do basic, you know, math and answer basic questions on logic, what are they teaching the children? So it's a myriad of issues. Which ones should be tackled first?
Well, research evidence is very clear. The most important in-school determinant of educational quality is the teacher. So it's important for the government to guarantee a qualified, a trained, and highly motivated teacher for every student. But also within that context, let's not forget about the school as an environment. So it's important to assure a quality school for every Ghanaian child. So it's all the factors really combined, but the teacher is the most important.
Right. For you, Mr. Kovey?
Yeah, so there are all necessary conditions. The teacher is very important, just here, number one. Then if you have qualified teachers, and then they're there, and then the learning, you know, today we are in a advanced this in 21st century where we are shifting away from our traditional occupations, which is now being run by technology and everything. So if we have to also catch up with the rest of the world and then make our learners productive, economically productive, it means that one immediate effect, you have to start working on the learning environments. And I think apart from what Director said, what you should also be looking at is developing a roadmap that is smart. Right. So that if we cannot do all this year, but this year we are tackling this number, it should be consistent. Okay. That is why CAPCO and other partners are calling for decapping of the Govt fund. Okay. Very, very important. Okay. Because that is the sole source of education financing for education infrastructure, and then it has been capped at 17%. No, so the total accruals that come, you give 17.something% to education sector, and then you invest the rest in other sectors of the education. And that the children are languishing in the bush somewhere, some are not even having access to education. That is not a reasonable thing to do, because those who framed that, came up with the idea of setting up a fund to finance education infrastructure, they saw that by this time the population will grow by this rate, and so there's a need for that. But then we are not taking the money to go and invest in other things. So definitely we are killing the population.
So those are the other things that you're doing to advance your campaign for.
Yes. So I think next year we're going to scrutinize the political party manifestos very well. Right. Most of our public engagement, we look at what they have, the various parties. So as they are preparing their political party manifestos, with the unions, the CAPCO, through CAPCO and this, we're going to have public debate on this. What do you have for education? How smart is it? How feasible is it? It's not just going to be a promise and then you yes.
But what about you, Mr. Signolo, Education International Africa? What more are you doing to advance your work in Ghana?
Yes, several things. One, of course, this campaign, which we are supporting, but we have also supported a number of other activities. Some of them are still ongoing. For example, we have a program which we call Teacher Learning Circles, which brings together teachers from across the country to learn from each other, looking, for example, at formative assessment. So this type of assessment is diagnostic, so they are to identify the challenges faced by learners or students and then come up with solutions together collectively as teachers. To us, that's an important program because it can help improve teaching and learning. We have also been running a program on social dialogue. So it's a capacity building program, bringing the teacher unions together, but also the education officials so that they can sharpen and share skills on how to improve engaging with each other to improve education policy. And then related to that, there was an important program which is still ongoing actually, which we call the Education Workforce Initiative. It started from the Education Commission of the United Nations, and then in Africa there are 2 countries. They focused on Ghana and Sierra Leone. Therefore, in that context, EI Africa has been funding that program, bringing together teacher unions as well as various government agencies to come and dialogue about education policy.
I really appreciate your time here this morning, and hopefully you'll be able to do some good work like the testimonies you've shared from other African countries. You'll be able to share those same testimonies when we have you again sometime in the future. That was Dennis Signolo. He is Regional Director of Education International Africa, and he was here with Richard Kovey. He is convener a campaign against privatization and commercialization of education. Kapkoi. We'll take a quick breather here. We need to sip on some water. When I come back, I've got more to share with you. Do stay.